Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Kairos Prairies North event called Bill C-15, Step Forward or Step Back. My name is Javid Summers, and I am one of a group of about 9 settler individuals in Saskatchewan and Alberta who have come together under the Kairos umbrella to organize this event. We are committed to seeing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples implemented and hope that this event will allow us to better understand the proposed Bill C-15 and various Indigenous perspectives on it. We have lined up an incredible panel of Indigenous thought leaders from the prairies, and we are really excited for tonight's event and happy that you have joined us. I will provide more comments as to tonight's format, but let me first start by acknowledging the land we are joining from. We are all joining this event tonight from across the land now known as Canada. And I invite you to reflect on the particular land you are on tonight and your relationship to it, even as I do the same. Personally, I am coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, but I hope all of us can find some resonance in these words. As a settler in Edmonton, Alberta, I have the privileges and responsibilities associated with living in Treaty 6 territory. I acknowledge that the land I live, work, worship, and relate on is land that Indigenous peoples have lived on since time immemorial, and that was generously shared with my ancestors and with me. I acknowledge that although treaty was entered into with the expectation of relations that would be mutually beneficial, in fact, Canada has dispossessed Indigenous peoples and continues to do so today. For this, I acknowledge my responsibility both as an individual and as a member of the settler collective. And I commit to working to change that and restore the spirit and intent of treaty relations. Before we go further, I had the honor of asking the Reverend Mary Fontaine to open us in prayer. I was unfortunately not able to present tobacco to her personally, but it has been mailed to her and she has graciously accepted. Reverend Fontaine is Cree from Mistawasis First Nation in Saskatchewan and ordained in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. She is the founder and executive director of Hummingbird Ministries, an Indigenous-led healing and reconciling ministry of the Presbytery of Westminster in British Columbia. Mary, if you're ready, I'll hand it over to you to start us off in a good way. Thank you.
Thank you, Javid, and everyone who is here today. I'm honored to be asked to be here to pray in this very important event. It's a very, very important work that we're doing together. And I just want to add that, yes, I am a Presbyterian minister, but I'm also a Nehiyah woman, which means that I embrace and respect the culture and the spirituality of my people. And I'm also from Treaty 6. For my growing up years, I always heard my mushroom praying, "How goes thou, you know, Gananaskumtinano manaskamiak, Matsuin. Ikitamaxiak go my sinowak, Lichianan, Kitamaxinan, go thou, you know, Sawamnan." It's a prayer of humility, a prayer that made me look around the surroundings in my little home where I grew up, in a two-room log shack that my dad built. And I thought of the poverty of our people. I thought he was talking about that all our furniture was homemade. And later on, I realized it's not our spirit, it's not our material poverty that my mushroom was talking about. He was talking about our spiritual poverty. As human beings, we've done a lot of damage to each other. And a lot of damage has been done to our people through all the many ways that colonialism has hit us in so many ways, including our children. So undoing some of this work is key, is very important. And my hope that through UNDRIP, that things can come together, that there is more freedom, there's more equality, and there's inclusion and respect for our people. And so I pray both ways at Hummingbird Ministries. I teach the children to honor their own ways, as well as to respect the person who came, that my mom had a lot of respect for, the one who came from the Star People to come and try and teach us how to love, how to walk in a good way and not to take too much from this earth. He didn't even have a bed of his own. I think he might have been half Cree or something. I'm just kidding. I just want to start out with the Lord's Prayer, and then I'm going to sing a Lakota song, a Lakota prayer for you. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. O great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the wind, whose breath gives life to all the world. Hey, hey, oh. Hear me, O God, Creator. I need your strength and wisdom. Hey, hey, oh. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever behold the red and purple sunset. Hey, hey, oh. Make my hands respect the things you have made, and my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise so that I may understand the things you have taught my people. Hey, hey, oh. Help me to remain calm and strong in the face of all that comes towards me. Let me learn the lessons you have hidden in every rock and leaf. Hey, hey, oh. Help me see pure thoughts and act with the intention of helping others. Hey, hey, oh. Help me find compassion without empathy overwhelming me. Hey, hey, oh. I seek strength not to be greater than my brother, but to fight my enemy, myself. Make me always ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes. Hey, hey, oh. Hey, 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 oh. So when life fades as a fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. Hey, hey, oh. Hey, 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 oh. Hi, hi. Prayer is for all of us as we go forth in this work and in this meeting, that we will be all those things that we have prayed for. Thank you, David.
Hi, Mary. Thank you so much for the prayer. I just have a few more housekeeping items to mention before we get to our panel. First, we are not going to be taking questions tonight as we want to maximize our time with the speakers. But we will be offering a chance to meet up again tomorrow to debrief some of what we have heard. So stay tuned and we'll share details about that at the end. You may have noticed we're in a webinar format, so there's no chat function tonight. And if you're having any technical issues, we ask that you contact Shannon Neufeld. Her email was in the confirmation email you received earlier this week. Finally, many of you know that at many Indigenous gatherings, prize draws are often an exciting feature, and our moderator has suggested we do this tonight as well. So I'm very excited to tell you that we will be doing a draw at the end of the evening for a wonderful new book from Louise Half, also known as Sky Dancer. Sky Dancer is a poet from Satellite Cree Nation in Alberta who lives in Saskatoon and is currently the Canadian Parliamentary Poet Laureate. Her book is called Oasis, Kinky and Disheveled, and although it isn't officially coming out until later this year, we have an advanced signed copy for you. But you need to still be with us at the end of tonight's event to win, so stick around. Now, without further ado, I have the honor of introducing our moderator for tonight's discussion, Maureen Johns. I only met Maureen for the first time last week, but I could tell immediately that she is going to do a wonderful job of leading us tonight. Maureen is from Pasqua First Nation outside of Regina, where she is the Director of Education. She has a master's degree in education and is sought after as a speaker and educator. Maureen, please take it away.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I think I finally pushed all the correct buttons to appear here visually. Thank you so much to Reverend Mary Fontaine for the beautiful prayer. I felt the Spirit move especially in the singing part. So thank you very much, Reverend Mary, for starting us off in such a good way. I'd also like to acknowledge the organizers of this evening's event, Kairos North, for being so thoughtful in your preparation of this evening's event. So the word moderator is a little bit interesting. Moderator typically implies that the person will be neutral and not have an opinion. I have been assured that at the conclusion, when I am allowed to speak, that I can speak freely. So if you're expecting a neutral, that's not what you're going to receive. The format is that we will hear 3 speakers tonight, Indigenous women, all very highly esteemed women in their homes, in the nations that they come from, and in the cities and towns and villages in which they've done their work. We will hear from 3 speakers. I will introduce each speaker, and each speaker will have an amount of time to express their thoughts on our topic today. And at the end of the 3 speakers, I will have an opportunity to do a bit of a summary. And then people from Kairos North will talk about next steps, acknowledgements, and so on as we end our evening. So what I would like to do to get us going is to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mary Ellen Trepel Lafond, Akikwe. Mary Ellen is a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation here in Saskatchewan. She is a tenured professor of law at the University of British Columbia and has served as a Saskatchewan Provincial Court judge for 20 years. Mary Ellen has also served as British Columbia's first representative for children and youth, and recently completed an investigation of Indigenous Pacific racism in the British Columbia healthcare system. Her report is titled In Plain Sight. Mary Ellen also serves as a legal team member for the Assembly of First Nations and has prepared a document for the AFN comparing Bill C-15 to Bill C-262. Please take it away, Mary Ellen Trepel Lafond.
Thank you so much, Maureen, for that introduction. And I hope everyone can see and hear me. I just want to say that I'm thank Kairos for the gift and the invitation. And I want to say that I'm zooming into this virtual event today from Lekwungen speaking people's territory, the home of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nation. So I'd like to acknowledge that I get to work on their unceded and treaty territory. I also just wanted to note that while I have at times provided advice to the Assembly of First Nations, which is my client, and the First Nations Leadership Council, that the opinions and views that I'll be expressing today are my views and not the views of any client that I might have been associated with. So just wanted to make that point. I also have a brief PowerPoint that I'm going to share and that I've asked the organizers to ensure is available to all participants. So I want to talk about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, sort of from a bit of a different lens of the experience that certainly I've had in working in the province of British Columbia with First Nations in British Columbia, and how we've been using the UN Declaration to address, in particular, racism in healthcare. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of federal legislation to implement the UN Declaration and our experience in BC. just to give some reflections back and forth, because they're very different experiences, but they're quite important contrasts. And so I want to frame a bit about my more sort of pragmatic understanding of how we're dealing with implementing the UN Declaration. So most of you will know that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in their key principles and one of their fundamental calls, was to adopt the UN Declaration as the framework for reconciliation. And that's a pretty loaded, lot of jargon in that. But the UN Declaration, of course, is a document that was developed with Indigenous diplomacy and Indigenous participation from all over the world, but including from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit here. And also, there was previously the private members bill that was introduced by Romeo Saganish, Bill 262. Now we have before the House of Commons a government bill. And the government bill, or Bill C-15, it's called, is the attempt to implement a federal bill and bind Canada to implementing the UN Declaration. So a couple of other points. And first of all, I want to make a note that it is required with international treaties and agreements that they be implemented. And I know other panelists will talk about this. I know Professor Gunn, as an example, recently testified before the Standing Committee looking into Bill C-15. But the legislation, federal legislation, is there to implement the declaration. So parts of the declaration itself are customary international law and do not need further implementation, like a prohibition on genocide. That is a prohibition that applies. It's a fundamental norm, and it doesn't have to have anything further. But the declaration itself is a declaration, not a convention, and there's lots of different parts of it, and it's quite a rich and important legal document expressing the minimum standards for the survival and dignity for First Nations and for Indigenous peoples around the globe. So it was developed in a global context. As I note on the slide here, Bill C-15 follows the model of Bill 262, and the federal government committed to reintroduce, because Bill 262 got through the House of Commons and died in the Senate, they made a commitment to reintroduce a government bill with the floor, or the sort of framework, being the private members bill introduced and advocated very strongly for by Romeo Saganish. Now, while this whole federal piece was going on, in British Columbia, there was work with First Nations and the government of British Columbia and all parties in the British Columbia legislature to have implementation legislation in BC. And in November 28th, 2019, the BC legislature unanimously passed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. We call it DRIPA in British Columbia. And that was really celebrated by lots of leaders of Indigenous governments, and everyone kind of came together. And so it has a unique look in British Columbia. It's a bit different than the federal bill. I was involved a bit in the BC one as well, working with First Nations in British Columbia. So this is about a year. We've had a pandemic, but I wanted to talk to you about some of the tools that the UN Declaration being implemented in British Columbia have brought to the table. There's so much work to be done to roll back, 150 years of colonialism and flawed thinking and bad policies. There's much, much work ahead. However, there have been some valuable tools that this Declaration Act being implemented in BC have brought, which I want to compare and contrast with the federal bill. The other thing I wanted to just say before I get there, though, is there have been a lot of concerns expressed by First Nations about the federal bill. And I just wanted to identify a couple of sources of those, because they're everywhere. They're also in British Columbia. There are issues that I fully acknowledge and would like to put on the foreground, because these are concerns I also have. One is that bold rhetoric from government since 2016 has not been matched with real action. There's a real worry that these initiatives don't get implemented, that things don't move forward. Moving from the tradition of Canada and provinces like Saskatchewan and others denying the rights of Indigenous peoples at every level, collective and individual, that really entrenched mentality of denying rights, making Indigenous people prove everything, having to work so hard to get treaties implemented and acknowledged. This has required all the effort and an imbalance of all the effort on the Indigenous people's shoulders, with government always taking an opposition role. So as government started to make more promising words federally about shifting that since 2016, a lot of concerns about whether or not there's trust, there's truth, there's real movement, whether it's dealing with water advisories and all of the fundamental things that have not shifted. So I want to really acknowledge that and foreground that and say I share that. Also to say that the dynamic of trust and mistrust is really integral to the success and failure of work like implementing the Declaration and work that's called reconciliation, which a lot of people reject as a concept itself, as having had governments take it and make it meaningless. So there's really great mistrust, and the rebuilding of trust is not on the shoulders of Indigenous people. It has to be on the shoulders of governments. And that's, again, where there hasn't been a lot of effort and a lot of concern. So I want to validate and acknowledge those points, and I'm sure other panelists will speak to them more. This has to be meaningful. This has to be substantial. And implementing the Declaration is one very significant issue, but it's far from the only thing that needs to be done. So I just wanted to also identify what are the key legal obligations in Canada that are created or come forward, again, like in Bill 262 with this new federal bill, Bill C-15. So there's 3 obligations, just to be really clear, obligations that bind Canada. First, the obligation to have the laws and policies of Canada be consistent with the implementation of the Declaration or the articles in the Declaration. And so the UN Declaration itself is, as I said, a pretty complex document. There's 46 articles. Many of you will have like a little book about the Declaration that's been prepared by the NCTR, really helpful book that you can get from them. So the laws are to be aligned with these 46 articles. There's a requirement that Canada, in collaboration and cooperation with Indigenous people, do an action plan. Those are 2 distinct things. Action plan to implement the Declaration. Automatically, though, if Bill C-15 comes into force, there's a requirement to have consistency, or what I call alignment of laws. And then third, there's an obligation on Canada to report annually on the progress in implementing the Declaration in both aligning laws and also carrying out an action plan. And that reporting goes to the Parliament and goes to standing committees where Indigenous and other people can have some accountability and have some hearings. As I indicated, similar legislation was passed in British Columbia. And I want to talk a little bit about the work I've done, as was mentioned at the outset, in reviewing healthcare. So I was asked by the Minister of Health and First Nations and the Métis Nation of BC to conduct an examination of the BC healthcare system to see whether or not anti-Indigenous racism was present in the point of care in the healthcare system. And again, I have a couple of documents that I can share with you just about how this was framed. The review of to see if there's anti-Indigenous racism was really grounded in the implementation of the UN Declaration. So I put up here on this slide some of the key concepts. So this is healthcare. Okay, so we're coming right down to things that matter, and actually things that deeply matter to Indigenous women and other people who have been trying to get services and supports without discrimination. And I put on this slide Article 24. There's a couple of key articles in the Declaration. Article 24 guarantees Indigenous people the right to traditional medicines, maintaining health practices, and conserving plants, medicines, animals, and minerals, but also accessing without discrimination all health and social services. And the second part of Article 24 gives Indigenous individuals, so an individual right, to have equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and states need to take progressive steps to address this. So the issue of racism in healthcare has been a very significant issue for many, many years. With the pandemic, this has come to the forefront. In British Columbia, one of the values of having had legislation to implement the Declaration is now having a tool. So Article 24, there's other articles. Article 22 stresses that particular attention should be paid to circumstances of elders, women, youth, children, persons with disabilities, and making sure they enjoy full expression and guarantees and protection of all the rights, and this is quite important. So these articles of the Declaration, in a place like British Columbia where the Declaration is being implemented, allow us to go into the healthcare system. So for me, it allowed me to meet with all the health regulators, nurses, doctors, all the health authorities, hospital staff, to take complaints, to look at this issue, and also look at the obligation that every professional standard had to be read in alignment with Article 24, which meant we're no longer debating about whether or not those issues on the slide like racism exist. We're talking about how it is present and how we need to take it down. We also are shifting our mindset because we're using the Declaration in a really pragmatic way, shifting our mindset, our tools and practices to be more anti-racist, to promote cultural humility, and to look more about some outcomes that are really important for Indigenous people. Substantive equality, not everyone has the same starting point, but you must have equal opportunity and build those good health outcomes. Cultural safety, when you go to get care, you need to get care in a way that's actively anti-racist, takes apart discrimination, removes barriers, creates a safe environment, and the protection of Indigenous human rights. This is a bit of a graphic that as I say, it's in the PowerPoint, you can look at it. It's kind of like a summary of the health work, but using Article 24, myself and a small kind of Indigenous team that looked at racism in healthcare was really able to go in and take apart where the colonial health problems have come from. The segregated systems, the separate Indian hospitals, the substandard treatment that's been part of the history, then coming into looking at care at the point of care, broadly surveying, engaging, and everyone engaged in the review. Everyone wanted to participate because there's a common commitment to address racism, understand anti-Indigenous racism, and work to eradicate it from the healthcare system. So that was quite positive. It wasn't like an argument. It was people working together, coming together around this very positive thing, the Declaration. We had to expose some really difficult truths in British Columbia about the stereotypes about First Nations and Métis people that are still in healthcare. They're likely in healthcare in Saskatchewan, maybe to a less degree, maybe to a greater degree. I haven't looked at it, but the tool is really valuable. We were able to look at discrimination, what that looks like in healthcare. We were able to look at how discrimination and racism drive poor access to care and poor outcomes. So we were able to do a really systematic look at the behaviors, the beliefs, and the systems using tools in the Declaration. So why did I think that's kind of important? And I've got a link to all the reports and so forth if you'd like to look at it. I think that's really important because, well, laws may or may not be as good as they could be. And I'm going to talk about some possible improvements to Bill C-15 from my respectful view. As I said, I'm speaking for myself only here. Because having applied the Declaration and working with it in the healthcare system to deal with racism, improve cultural safety, cultural humility, and improve actual lived experience for Indigenous people, I think it's really important to get legislation right and get it strong and not to make it confusing. So here's a couple of things, at least 4 things that I think are kind of important that I would like to see strengthened and debated. This legislation is now in the committee, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee in the House of Commons at second reading. It'll go through that committee and probably go to the Senate and have another review. So it is important to take forward thoughts and ideas to strengthen the legislation. So here's 4 areas that I think are important. 1, I'm not super impressed with the non-derogation wording in this bill, and to be really clear that implementing the Declaration should not in any way lead to the diminishment of the rights of Indigenous people. We need to make sure that nothing happens here around that trust and mistrust feelings that we have for good reason to somehow make it implementing the Declaration, but at a lesser standard under the control of Canada that undermines self-determination and the rights of Indigenous people. So I'd like to see some more thought given to that. I'd like to see, given what I've said, that the preamble, which talks about eliminating all forms of violence against Indigenous people with particular attention to women, elders, persons with disabilities, and two-spirited LGBTQ plus persons, I would like to see racism added, particularly to an objective to eradicate racism, because it is so prevalent in policing and the justice system and the child welfare system and the healthcare system, and it has caused so much difficulty. And doing the review of racism recently, Indigenous people that I've worked very carefully with have been really clear. And I want to give a shout out to Professor Holly Graham at U of S, who was an external reviewer on this recent report, and was great help to me. Indigenous people have really said, give the racism back to the system, so it's their problem to deal with. So we want Canada to have to deal with that. So I'd like to see that added. The other thing is they're really powerful doctrines. Certain doctrines, colonial doctrines, have been used in the legal system to dispossess Indigenous people and to justify it. And these are the doctrines of superiority. They're referred to in Bill C-15. I would like to see Bill C-15 specifically call for the renunciation or rejection of the Doctrine of Discovery and terra nullius. The Supreme Court of Canada in 2014 in the Silcoteen decision said those doctrines do not have legal force in Canada, but I still think they are applied in provinces and territories and in Canada, and they still have power to view Indigenous peoples' connection to their lands and territories as somehow capable of inferior to settler concepts. So it'd be good to reject that as a way to shift forward. Finally, my final thought is just the bill itself. I'm not going to go through a big technical thing, but I find it quite confusing in places. It's like, are we implementing a plan to implement the declaration, or are we implementing the declaration? So I find some of the language and wording a little bit stepping back from just fully committing to this and sort of kicking it down the road. And I'm really concerned about kicking things down the road because things are a crisis and we need to do much better than we have done. And I'm just going to pause there because I only have so much time. I look forward to hearing questions or comments. And of course, I look forward to listening and learning to my co-panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am so impressed with what I've just heard. I'm almost speechless. At the closer to the end of our evening together, we'll have opportunity to comment a little bit more broadly on what each panelist has talked about. And the participants will also have opportunity for further involvement and to have your voice. That will be outlined by Mark at the close of the tonight's session with something special being scheduled for tomorrow evening. So I know when I'm on webinars, I love that chat feature, but you will notice that the chat feature has been disabled for the majority of this evening. So thank you very much, Mary Ellen Trepel-Lafond. Our next speaker is Brenda Gunn. And Brenda is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. Brenda is a proud Métis woman and a lawyer. Her current research focuses on promoting greater conformity between international law on the rights of Indigenous peoples and domestic law. Brenda has provided technical assistance to the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the analysis and drafting of the report summarizing the responses on the survey on implementing the UN Declaration. Welcome, Brenda. Take it away.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here this evening on this esteemed panel. I would really like to thank Kairos for the invitation and thank Reverend Fontaine for the opening. I am sitting tonight in Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Métis, my traditional territory here in Winnipeg. I'm currently sitting in my parents' house where I've been staying for the last almost 3 weeks while my spouse has been in the hospital with semi-emergent, urgent health situation. So it's been a rough few weeks for my family, and I think it's all coalesced tonight into quite the headache. So if I'm perhaps more rambly than usual or less coherent than usual, my apologies. As I was preparing for tonight, I was kind of struggling to think about, what do I want to say? What do I have to say to this audience? I've been speaking quite a bit on C-15 recently. I did a guest lecture yesterday for our human rights class and the Parliamentary Standing Committee last week and an Amnesty International event, and just trying to think about what is useful for people to hear, and not wanting to repeat what, of course, was already said. But I thought maybe what I would do is start with a little bit about Bill C-262. I think that's already been highlighted, but I wanted to point out maybe one or two additional aspects. And then I want to talk a bit about what C-15 does and why, from my perspective, thinking about why are we pushing to implement the UN Declaration in this way with this legislation. And then I thought it might be useful to talk a little bit more broadly from my perspective of why even are we talking about the UN Declaration, and why do I spend so much time thinking about it? To help contextualize, at least from my perspective, why I support the bill generally. And then if I haven't run out of time, I would maybe talk a bit about some of the challenges that I've heard and maybe address what I think are some misunderstandings of either international law or the role of the UN Declaration in Canadian law. And yeah, I think that'll probably more than enough take me through my time here today. So as was already mentioned, we had Bill C-262, and I really want to acknowledge and thank Romeo and his team for the work they did in getting the legislation as far as they did. He worked extremely hard, going coast to coast, meeting with communities and hearing from people and garnering a large amount of support from Indigenous peoples for the bill. And I think it's really significant because as a private member's bill, he managed to get the support of the governing party. Eventually, the Liberals came on board after a lot of lobbying from Indigenous peoples and allies. They made it all the way through the House. They made it through the Senate reading, through Senate committee, and it was really disappointing for many of us when the Conservative senators were successful in killing Bill C-262 through various filibustering activities and preventing the bill from being passed before Parliament rose for the election in 2019. And I don't think, it wasn't lost on many of us that the bill died on National Aboriginal Day, right? So on a day where we would hope to celebrate and see progress, we saw a really devastating blow to the work of many advocates. And I only want to highlight this because for me, the idea behind 262 and now the baseline for C-15 was really something that began with Indigenous peoples and had large Indigenous support. So we see that after the bill died, there was a lot of lobbying to try to push the Liberal government to introduce a similar bill. And there was success in getting the Liberal government, as was mentioned, to include in their election platform a commitment to introduce a bill with 262 as the floor. After many delays, including COVID, there was finally the introduction of Bill C-15 in December 2020. And I think many of us were really surprised by the amount of resistance that we've seen since the introduction of the bill, in part because of the strong support that existed for 262. And I think from my perspective, I think there's many reasons, and maybe I'm really interested to hear how other panelists are thinking through this. But I really agree with Mary Ellen that the lack of trust between Indigenous peoples and the government is there, and I think that's sort of part of what is animating it. And I think there's distrust in process, there's distrust in the substance of the act, but I do think that it's helpful to remember that this idea, Bill C-15, is not a liberal idea, right? This isn't an idea that is coming from the Liberal government. It's something that many Indigenous peoples have pushed for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? And much longer. So I think that context is helpful, that it's, I really do think there's an opportunity, if we choose, to continue to have some ownership over what is included in the Act. So I think it was already discussed a little bit, what was inside the Act. I don't think I need to repeat that, but I want to just highlight from my perspective why the Act includes the elements that it does, including I want to highlight the National Action Plan and the clarification on the application in Canadian law. So one of the things, at least from my perspective, one of the reasons that the legislation includes reference to a national action plan is because this is something, again, Indigenous peoples have pushed for at the international level. So in 2014, there was a World Conference on Indigenous Peoples held at the United Nations that happened after Indigenous peoples lobbied for many years after the adoption of the UN Declaration that they wanted the UN to continue the work to implement and realize the rights in the UN Declaration. And one of the ways in which that happens internationally is through a World Conference. And so in preparation of the World Conference, there is the development of an outcome document. And in the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples is a reference that states commit to undertaking a national action plan. And again, I want to highlight that this was not an idea coming from nation states. The inclusion of the National Action Plan was the result of lobbying of Indigenous peoples. And so the Indigenous peoples engaged in the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples based on what is often referred to as the ALTA outcome document. So there was a large international gathering in Alta, Norway, where Indigenous peoples from the 7 different regions came together and discussed what they would like to see coming out of the World Conference. And one of the top priorities for the World Conference was the idea of a national action plan that states should actually be taking a coordinated approach with Indigenous peoples to work to achieve the ends of the UN Declaration or implement the UN Declaration. So again, I think it was really important to see legislation that implements the UN Declaration, not to just sort of cut and paste the UN Declaration into legislation, but actually to have a law that requires the government to work with Indigenous peoples across Canada to try to understand how the general human rights standards apply in specific contexts. And it allows us, in theory, done right, a national action plan allows us to avoid pan-Indian type of approaches or sort of a national approach, but it allows us to address the specificities of different peoples across the country. Secondly, I think it's really important to clarify the application of the UN Declaration in Canadian law, because the one thing that I have seen, unfortunately, time and time again over the last 10, 15 years, is a real failure of understanding the basic principles of the reception of international law into Canadian law by lawyers and judges. It never ceases to amaze me how often I can read decisions where judges are getting fundamental principles of international law wrong. There's a case that I've used in many presentations where a leading jurist of the Ontario Court of Appeal in a single paragraph makes at least 3 errors of international law, makes reference to the UN Declaration not applying in Canada because Canada had not signed and ratified the declaration, right? So if esteemed judges of the Ontario Court of Appeal can make such basic errors, it becomes clear that there's either a lot of education to be done for lawyers and judges, so they're making submissions that help judges understand the application, or we need a really straightforward statement in law that the UN Declaration applies, and we no longer have to get into those conversations about what is a declaration, how does it apply, how is it different from a convention, what are the impacts. So it takes away a lot of that need to debate whether or not it applies, and actually allows then for courts to consider more specifically about how to use the UN Declaration to apply, to assist in various circumstances. So I see a lot of wisdom in the simplicity of this legislation. I've written in response to 262, and I've sort of noted that it's very modest legislation. Some might say it does very little because it's simply, setting out a framework for further implementation. But I think that simplicity is useful. It helps set the framework for moving forward to implement the UN Declaration. It gives us key reporting and accountability. It gives us transparency by having those periodic reports happen. And so from my perspective, Bill C-15 gives us some basic tools to begin to work towards implementing the UN Declaration. So why is it that we even want to implement the UN Declaration? And I don't know if I need to convince this audience or not. But one of the ways that I think about why we might want to implement the UN Declaration, or why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission referred to the UN Declaration as the framework for reconciliation, can be found in the preamble of the UN Declaration. So the starting point for the UN Declaration and the preamble is a recognition that Indigenous peoples are peoples, equal to all other peoples. And this is really significant. This idea that we have to accept that national law and international law have for a long time undermined or failed to recognize Indigenous peoples as peoples. This preamble also goes on to recognize that Indigenous peoples also have the right to consider themselves different and to be respected for those differences, right? So not only are Indigenous peoples peoples, but we're also Indigenous, and we are not to be discriminated against for those differences. The UN Declaration preamble also recognizes that Indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustices as a result of colonization and dispossession from their lands, territories, and resources. So recognizing fundamentally the removal of Indigenous peoples from their lands, and I don't always mean the physical removal, the development of resources that limits access to resources is just as much a dispossession from lands. And that really impacts Indigenous peoples' fundamental human rights. Next, the UN Declaration and the United Nations says that they are convinced that recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples will enhance harmonious and cooperative relations between the state and Indigenous peoples. And so the idea is we have to accept in colonial countries that the failure to recognize rights is what is leading to the discord. And if we want to address that situation, we must do so on the basis of recognizing inherent fundamental human rights and base this new relationship on the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination, and good faith. And so based on that idea, the UN proclaims the UN Declaration as a standard of achievement to be pursued in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect. So a reminder that implementing the UN Declaration is not something that nation states can do on their own, but rather they must work with Indigenous peoples in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect to implement the UN Declaration. And so for me, I think it's really important to begin the work to implement the UN Declaration as one of the tools that Indigenous peoples can have and can use to achieve their aspirations. But what we've seen, I think recently, is a lot of pushback from various corners. We all expected the pushback from the conservative corners. I can tell you that the questions that I was asked in the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs last week from conservative members of the committee were more or less the exact questions I got 3 years ago, and it was almost 3 years to the date when I was presenting before the Standing Committee on 262. Those questions were the same. So the conservative corners of Parliament and of Canadian society continue to hit home concerns about what is free, prior, and informed consent. What does consent mean? And they take a lot of time in these committees saying, what does consent mean? What does consent mean? And they come up with many different ways to ask that same question. But I think what was perhaps a bit more surprising was some of the resistance that we've seen growing from various Indigenous organizations and Indigenous peoples and grassroots. The concerns I've heard include that we want to question C-15 because it's somehow undermining inherent rights, or this concern about domesticating international law into Canadian law, or that it is confirming the doctrine of discovery or undermining Indigenous sovereignty. And those ideas I find troubling, in part because I'm not sure how accurate they are. From my perspective, at least, the UN Declaration, when you read it, is very clear in grounding Indigenous people's human rights in Indigenous people's own custom laws and traditions. So any work to implement the UN Declaration requires us to turn to Indigenous people's own customs, laws, and traditions. And this is really clear, say, in the area of land rights, where the UN Declaration simply says Indigenous peoples have a rights to their traditional lands, territories, and resources. Well, how do we understand what those rights are or where those rights are? You have to turn to Indigenous people's own laws, and that's the foundation. And that has been really clearly established in international law over the last 15, 20 years. There's also this idea that people now, again, are turning to Article 46 of the UN Declaration that talks about the territorial integrity and political unity of the state. And I thought we had addressed and debunked all the concerns regarding Article 46 when we were working to get Indigenous peoples across the country informed and supporting the UN Declaration. And I just thought maybe it's worth reiterating that Article coming the Declaration on Decolonization and Independence of States, and some of the understandings of the right to self-determination. I just got to notice my internet is unstable. Oh, it's because the microwave is being used in the house, I think. I hope you can still hear me. I'm going to keep talking. The Article 46, the idea of political unity and territorial integrity of a nation state, the state's right to territorial integrity is contingent upon a state recognizing and fulfilling people's rights of self-determination. So said a different way, under international law, if a state fails to uphold or fulfill people's rights to self-determination, they no longer have the right to territorial integrity and political unity. And this is very standard. This is the basis that we see in international law. I wonder if I turn off my video for a minute. I'm going to see if that works. My apologies. I don't have a hard connection at my current location. So just to reiterate, a state's right to to territorial integrity and political unity is contingent upon recognizing the right of self-determination. The UN Declaration is also really clear in its support of treaties and the inherent right of treaties. I also think implementing the UN Declaration is significant because there's another declaration, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the provision on treaties there is even stronger and talks about implementing the spirit and intent of treaties. And so any action that we take towards implementing the UN Declaration and the recognition of treaties, I think helps us move towards greater recognition and support of the inherent spirit and intent of treaties. And then I just maybe will make two more points. I'll try to come back on camera, see if my internet has settled down. The final point is this idea of domesticating the UN Declaration. There's a lot of concern in Canada, and I hear it from the elders that I've worked with about the way in which Canadian courts decided that treaties between the Crown and Indigenous peoples are not international treaties, but are sui generis. And this concern about the way courts domesticated treaties. One of the issues that has arisen is one of the concerns I've heard is how implementing the UN Declaration through Bill C-15 is domesticating the International Human Rights Declaration into Canadian law. I think we want to be careful in how we think about that. When we're talking international law, domesticate is the term we use for implementation. So under international law, states are required to domesticate their international human rights obligations by bringing them from the international level down into the domestic legal regime. So I think the idea of the concerns in how domesticating treaties, taking away that international character, that is 100% problematic. And from the research I've done, was not based in any international law or had any support in Canadian law, but was purely racist in its decision making. That's very different from taking international law and applying it into domestic law, because you still have to maintain the international standards. You can't implement international human rights law in a way that undermines or undercuts or lowers the standards that have been set. And finally, just maybe one or two more quick points. I think I'm out of time. I think implementing the UN Declaration in Canada, particularly Bill C-15, can be really helpful in what I would say blowing open the scope of Section 15 or Section 35. I think implementing the UN Declaration in Canada requires us to throw out Vanderpeet and the justified infringements that the court has created in Sparrow, and requires us to reconsider that scope in line with new developments, including developments like the UN Declaration, similar to what the Canadian courts did when they revisited the physician-assisted death. So I think working to implement the UN Declaration gives us another moment in time that we can say we have to stop with the limitations of Section 35 that we've seen, and we have to raise the standard. But knowing that the legislation says nothing in implementing the UN Declaration can lower what we've already recognized in Section 35, it can only raise the bar. And maybe just one last point is I think we want to highlight the way in which the UN Declaration specifically recognizes socioeconomic rights and the importance of socioeconomic rights, particularly for Indigenous women. And so I think there's a lot to be gained, but I recognize that there are challenges, particularly with how the government approached consulting and working with Indigenous peoples in the development, and the need for the relationship to be strengthened and for trust to be built. And I think that will definitely take time, but maybe I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. If that's a job a person does with a headache, I would hate to see what would happen without a headache. Very impressive. Thank you so much, Brenda Gunn, for sharing your perspectives. Our third and final panelist of the evening is somebody from my home province of Saskatchewan. Allow me to introduce our third panelist. Sylvia Mcadam, Saseweham, is a Nehiyaw Cree woman from Big River First Nation in the Treaty 6 territory. She's a professor at the University of Windsor. She has her Juris Doctorate from the University of Saskatchewan and a bachelor's degree in human justice from the University of Regina. Sylvia is co-founder of a global grassroots Indigenous-led movement called Idle No More. Idle No More has changed the political and social landscape of Canada, as well as reached the global community to defend and protect all lands, waters, and animals. Sylvia has signed on to a letter opposing Bill C-15. I would like to add a point that Sylvia is also an author of a book named Cultural Teachings that I in the education system and other First Nations directors of education is so grateful to be able to utilize to guide some of the cultural teachings that we do with our students. So Sylvia, take it away.
Tansatoya, mistake na naskum no. Minam stay na naskum ximantu. Imiugis kaga nos mino kanyo up to go gisuo kigawi noaski mistake na naskum on your manos. I want to thank Kairos, and I want to thank everyone that brought us together. I'm honored to be here to speak with all of you, and you know, I have a PowerPoint, but I wanted to let you know as well that at first when UNDRIP was coming forward, I was, you know, I joined the walk and really happy, and I want to thank Steve and all the groups that came forward to support it. Like I agree, there was a lot of work that went into it, but then I read it. I read the Bill C-15 and I thought, oh, it got me. And then I thought, wait a minute. It said subject to the Constitution 35, section 35, and I thought, okay, I can't support this, and I'll explain to you why. Now, I'm going to share my PowerPoint here, and I'll walk you through what the issues are for me. And I want people to know that I am one of a descendant of treaty people. If I went to the treaty book right now and look for my grandfather, his name is on that treaty book. I want people to know that before I came to do this presentation, I smudged and I said prayers, because every time we speak of our laws and our way of being, it is about life. So we have to light up the sweetgrass, and I gave tobacco to knowledge keepers before I came to speak here, because that's our way of being and our way of doing and following our laws. So one of the laws that I must follow today is called Baastamuin. Baastamuin guides conversations, guides the language of Nihioyun. And that is the law that I follow today, to be careful how I speak and to be respectful. So I want all of you to know that. There are 3 reasons that I came up with to be skeptical about this. Now we look towards UN DRIP in British Columbia, and it was, with a lot of fanfare and different things. But I'm a realist. I stepped back and watched if BC would follow through with it, and sadly it didn't. It didn't follow through. Instead, it chose to disregard its own law when it came to the Wet'suwet'en and the tiny house warriors and other Indigenous peoples in their unceded lands. And then I thought, is this an indicator? Is this an indicator? Because honestly, there's no lack of legislation right now in terms of the history and currently. And the other reason is the Treaty 6 terms and promises, because this is where I speak from. I'm right now at the band office in what is referred to as the Big River First Nation, and I put that in quotations because that's really misleading. Right now, it's really, it's supposed to be called Kinomateo Band number 118, but that's the deception of colonization, right? It's the language of domination and dehumanization. Now, one of the things you need to look at that we all need to be skeptical about is the Mi'kmaq commercial fishing. Already, there's going to be another huge challenge and violence towards the Mi'kmaq fishers. And if Canada is really committed to this, I like to see action taken for the Mi'kmaq fisheries to continue fishing as their treaty right. And why is Canada being silent? Like, why are they being silent about this? Land back lane, another example. We have every reason to distrust what is happening right now. And then the land claims policy, the self-government and modern treaties, those are really problematic. And I'll explain to you why and why the land claims process is really problematic. In Saskatchewan here, I want to bring it home now. I did a quick snapshot across our land here, what we say, Mswiskunk, on this side of Turtle Island, Mswiskunk. I did a quick snapshot. But bringing it back here to Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan is selling Crown land right now as we speak. The total as of 2014 is 1.4 million acres, 1.4 million acres being sold in complete violation to the number of treaties, even as I'm speaking to you from here. land is being sold. And yet the land claims policy right now, there's reserves that have been waiting 30 years through the land claims policy. And that land claims policy is really problematic because it entrenches and legitimizes the idea that the Crown has underlying title. And, you know, the underlying title is the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, all of us, and I'd be surprised if someone didn't hear about the Amazon rainforest. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it. And rightfully, you know, I see a lot of people outraged about the Amazon rainforest. And we all should be, rightfully. We should all be outraged. But what a lot of people don't know is the deforestation of the boreal forest. Look at, that's an image of my dad there. That's my dad. He is the treaty title holder for Treaty 6 here. And look at that. That's the deforestation of hunting lands that are supposed to be protected by treaty. They're supposed to be protected by treaty. And recently here in 2017, the militarization of conservation officers, they're carrying AK-15s. Look at that image of the gun there. That's what the conservation officers are carrying. And what for? What are they carrying that for? There's no legitimate reason, in my opinion, that they should be carrying militarized weaponry. And then recently again here, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2019, since the Gerald Stanley acquittal, this was passed, inferring that Indigenous peoples are the ones that are the dangerous people here, that we are a danger to private property owners. That's what I read into that. It's similar to that stand your ground. That's what it's done. It's diluted the liability of property owners should they kill anyone who is trespassing on private property, even though this is stolen land. And I'll explain how. And then there's the treaty term and promise to education. That's under Treaty 6. And yet there's a cap to the funding, which at the time it was Prime Minister Paul Martin that put that cap to the education. That's still, even though it was a promise to remove that, it hasn't been removed. And then again, the treaty term and promise to housing. Like there's such an epidemic of a housing shortage here, and yet it's a treaty term and promise, arguably in to Treaty 6. There's so many reasons not to trust what is happening all across our lands. Canada just filed a legal submission appealing the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal compensation with the Jordan's principle. Like, how do you do that again? Recently here, my brother and I were taken to court. You know, the provincial government was burning down our hunting cabins, and my dad's our family hunting cabin was one of the cabins that was burned down. And then we were trying to replace that cabin, to rebuild it and get back into our lands there. And we were taken to court for that. And then there's Bill C-45, which triggered Idle No More. It's one of the first suite of bills that were being introduced in the colonial parliament, and it's still law. And yet Trudeau had promised to remove it. It was a election promise, and it's still law today. That's going on 7 years now, 8 years. Now, the biggest reason for me here is the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, it's not called the Doctrine of Discovery. You're not going to read it in a case law and they're going to say it's the Doctrine of Discovery, but it is referred to as the underlying title of the Crown in any court case that you read. It's called the underlying title of the Crown. Yet the TRC 45(1) states repudiate concepts to justify, and it goes on, like you can read there in the doctrine repudiated. You know, the colonial state picks and chooses what it will work on, yet not once is this being mentioned. When is Canada going to quit using the underlying title of the Crown to justify its policies, its laws, jurisdiction and authority over Indigenous lands, which is why we were taken to court, because the province of Saskatchewan, under the Natural Resources Transfer Act, is saying that it has ownership, it has title to our hunting lands, and which is why today the province of Saskatchewan, under the Natural Resources Transfer Act, NRTA, is issuing permits to completely pillage and plunder the boreal forest. You know, when I mentioned the Amazon rainforest, people don't realize that Canada exceeds the Amazon rainforest in terms of the deforestation of lands. And they do this because they believe that they have jurisdiction, title, and authority to do so through the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, Section 35 of the Constitution, this is where the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it says nothing in this declaration may be construed as to diminish the existing, diminishing or extinguishing the rights of Indigenous people have now or may require in the future. However, Section 35, which I mentioned, was the very section that threw me off, and I said, no, I can't support this. It's because Vanderpeet and the Sparrow test does exactly this. It abrogates and derogates, diminishes Indigenous, like our treaties, our inherent sovereignty, our those sort of things. You know, that's what Section 35 does. And then you look at Section 46(1), where it says member states, like what Brenda mentioned. But you also have to remember, this is the section that is subject to Vanderpeet and the Sparrow test. So what I understand of what is going on here is it's another piece of colonial legislation that is going to doubly entrench what is already there. And what is already there is problematic, violates treaty because of these very tests that exist under Section 35. And every time that we have our own laws, if we begin establishing our own laws, are they going to be subject to these tests? And the state will see themselves fit to infringe on our, for example, Nihio laws. Nihio laws are our laws that have existed prior to European contact and still persist today. They would be subject to the Vanderpeet and Sparrow test, according to this declaration, from what I understand from my analysis and speaking with other Indigenous peoples. Now, Section 35 of the Constitution, some will say that it is a full box, and others will say that it is an empty box. Regardless, Section 35 has very problematic case law from the courts of Canada. And these courts have taken our treaties and made decisions on them. And Indigenous people have hoped that this would, by taking them to colonial courts, it would bind Canada to treat Indigenous people with dignity and respect for who we are. And quite honestly, it has not. It has not. From what I have seen and my experience through Idle No More, and my experience being on the lands and the waters of my people, when we went to court, the conservation officer didn't even know anything about Treaty 6. Under cross-examination, he knew nothing about Treaty 6. Treaty 6 are not historical documents. They are not. And you know, Section 35 involves Indigenous people, the Métis and the Inuit. And when you talk about human rights, a lot of people don't understand. What they don't know, the origin of the human rights were authored by a white supremacist. And we, as Indigenous people, we have to quit relying on the European white nation states to guide and direct our ways of being. We have to quit that, in my opinion. We have our own laws. We have our own ways of being. We have our inherent structures of leadership. And I'm not talking about the Indian Act. The Indian Act is an imposed system of leadership. And I was recently elected into this system, and I see the ugliness of it. I see another level of ugliness within it. And it's a terrible system. And yet, when we begin to talk about wanting to revitalize our inherent structures of leadership, where women within my nation are the law keepers, and they're the ones that teach and guide and revitalize the laws. There's nothing in place within these colonial structures really to support that. But the Indian Act is a terrible system. It is a terrible system. So is the Vanderpeet and Sparrow test. It will unilaterally infringe on the rights, the treaties, and anything else that has to do with Indigenous peoples. Now, I'm gonna show you this quick video, and Mark, if you could just set that up, and I want people to see a visual of the resource extraction that's happening. This is a very short video, and I want to thank the Yellowhead Institute for sharing it with me and providing it to the viewers here. And if you see here, this is all the current, past and current resource activity that's going on all across this side of Turtle Island, and it's still going on. And it's horrible, and we can't continue. We can't continue the kind of activities that are happening. Thank you, Mark. I'll go back and I want to let, there's a press release that's going to be issued out tomorrow, and you know, I want to be hopeful. I want to be hopeful, and I don't want to say that I don't have hope. However, history has shown that Canada does not respect Indigenous ways of being and doing. And if Canada is sincere about what they're proposing in terms of Bill C-15, I would rather see concrete action happen before any more words, because there's a lot of beautiful words being said, and yet when I go out to the land, I am faced with a lot of violence just to exercise my treaty right, my treaty term and promise to hunt, to fish, to gather. There's a lot of violence. There's no respect. So finally, I would rather rebuild Indigenous nations. I would rather see that being rebuilt to revitalize Nihil laws, our own structures of leadership, not the Indian Act. I would argue that Canada is an apartheid state. I would even clearly say I am not a Canadian, and I am offended when I hear media refer to Indigenous peoples as Indigenous Canadians. Again, that's really problematic. All of us need to learn and recognize the language of dehumanization and domination from that is connected to the doctrine of discovery, also referred to as the underlying title of the Crown. And Section 35 entrenches and legitimizes the doctrine of discovery. That's what it's done. And for Bill C-15 to be subject to Section 35 is really problematic. It's really problematic. So I can't remember who the author is, but I would rather, there's a quote that says, I would rather leave my children and my descendants a fight that they can live with than agreements that they cannot. So for me, I want to see action. I want to see action, and that action is to remove the land claims policies, rescind and abolish the doctrine of discovery, also referred to as the underlying title of the Crown. And if the colonial state called Canada is authentic about working with Indigenous peoples, then they need to honor the inherent structures of leadership prior to the Europeans coming here and working towards abolishing the Indian Act. I realize that this is a lot of work, It is a lot of work, but it needs to be done. It really needs to be done. The racism and the killing of Indigenous women and girls and all the symptoms of an apartheid state, a colonial state, are the symptoms of, as I said, they're the symptoms of colonization. So for the people that are listening in, I appreciate the people who have hope in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There was a lot of work put into it, but what it is today, from when it began, is a very watered down version. And what it's going to do to Indigenous people is just further entrench what is already in existence. And it's just it's just doing what it already has in terms of the problematic laws in Canada. But like, look at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, it wouldn't even honor that. So I'm a realist, and I read a lot, and the wording and the lack of action, the lack of political will is the real issue here. It's not because of lack of laws, lack of treaties. No, it's the political will. And the colonial state keeps getting away with it because of the racism and the dehumanization and domination of Indigenous peoples to keep us away from our lands. And it's done a pretty good job. It has, and it's done it by what I stated there, the militarization of the conservation officers, the private property laws, the amendment to it, selling off of Crown land in complete violation to treaty. So sometime at the end of April, I'll be walking, and I'll be walking to bring attention to the violation to treaty. So we'll see. I'm not jumping for joy anytime soon. So kinanas kum no kyo makani hiawi kan tohtawik puam ka kui ponitaya kamamsiak yegunu muniawi asuna mistake igutia kiktemaiho no muniawi asun yapsihta no tumakini hiaun no kakui nanapachihta hiutiam kakui mamsiak. So I just said a brief message to my people who speak the language, who are listening in. And I thank the other panelists, and I thank Kairos for giving us the opportunity to speak and to be part of this. And thank you, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. 3 presentations. My original plan, summarize what I heard from the 3 presentations, but I don't need to restate what has already been stated so well. In some of Sylvia's words, she talked about the role of women as law keepers who teach and guide and revitalize us. It's no surprise to me that the 3 panelists tonight are women. And I'd just like to leave that to resonate for a while, because what I have seen, the matriarchal societies, the nurturing, the power of women is never to be underestimated. Also thinking about the miracle of modern technology. If this were not during pandemic times, we might be in a conference room, getting up for coffee, served in fancy containers. But here we are in our own spaces, in our places, in our homes, with our family nearby, with the bed where we sleep nearby, with the kitchen where we eat. We're at home. And I think that this is just a miracle of the 21st century that we are able to come together using technology and to hear perspectives from people across Canada. Something that's very important is a line that our elder, Reverend Mary Fontaine, spoke in her prayer. A line she said was to make me always ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes, so that when the life fades as the fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. I have the belief that the organizers, the people behind Kairos, they support something that's very important to Indigenous peoples, to people on Earth, and that is the literacy of voice. Having a say, having the opportunity to express our thoughts, our ideas, our beliefs, to tell our stories, to repeat our narratives, to try to have our children know what our historical narratives are. The literacy of voice is a very important aspect of our 21st century. In the education world, Indigenous voices in the education system are responsible for integration of First Nations ways of knowing in the curriculum, in learning from and about and with Indigenous peoples. I believe in the literacy of voice. Through the miracle of technology and through the thoughtfulness of Kairos, we are now getting to practice having our literacy of voice. Another concept that I think is very important is we have three women speak from three different perspectives, each of them raised within families apart from each other, each of them on a different path to achieve their education, knowledge keepers in their own right. And yet what is common throughout all three presenters so far is that they have shared their version of the truth according to the lens with which they see the world. I have been told that in the Ojibwe language, there's a word for truth, and that the word doesn't have one truth, that the word for truth refers to the plurality of truth. So it doesn't mean that Mary Ellen's perspective is the truth. It doesn't mean that Brenda's perspective is the truth. It doesn't mean that Sylvia's perspective of the truth is the truth. What the plurality of truth is defined for human beings is that truth is arrived when we listen with respect to all the different perspectives that exist on topics that are important to us. My late Mushum, Henry John Adjicate, I have a primary document that he wrote in 1948. He wrote it in English and he wrote it in Cree syllabics. And basically what my Mushum Henry John Adjicate said, he was a leader, is that he was expressing in this primary document concern about Indigenous people that he led taking the vote, accepting our franchise to vote in Canada. I thought, wow, I thought it was a wonderful thing to get the vote. But when I read what Mushum Henry John Adjicate said, he expressed caution about taking the vote, that what would happen to Indigenous sovereignty if we accepted voting from the newcomers. And I heard Sylvia talk about that as well. Moving on from the plurality of truth and different perspectives, I'd like to look for a moment at the United Nations themselves. Let's think a moment on the United Nations. When I open the web page, I see the words peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. Those words jump out at you. They sound very good. Who could argue with it? Founded in 1945 with 193 member states, the UN has established other important documents: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. My understanding is that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So I'm saying to myself, are the globe's people now basking in human rights because the UN declared it? Or are the globe's children in a better position than they were before the Convention on the Rights of the Child? No. So how now can I expect any more from the latest UN proposal on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? Okay, so perhaps it's not fair to base a position on past UN declarations and conventions. I shouldn't prejudge how UNDRIP could improve our situation. Instead, what I'll do is I'll look to the authenticity of relationships with Indigenous peoples worldwide. Of the 193 nations making up the UN, do I see myself? Do I see my people? Do I see Indigenous people reflected? And once again, no. So will UNDRIP result in true, genuine relationship building, or will it result in more check marks, making Canada feel that they have passed the grade in regards to repairing the fractured relationships with Indigenous peoples? Is it about substance, or is it about symbolism? I have a metaphor to share with you to try to express my perspective. And what the metaphor is imagine we're before contact, before Turtle Island was visited, discovered. I owned a horse, a very good horse. Two Socks was my horse. The newcomers arrive here on Turtle Island. So, being the kind and generous person I am, I agree to share my horse, but with the conditions, I'll share my horse with you newcomers, but it's still my horse, but you can use it for what you need. Now, it seems that the newcomers are telling me that the horse might be mine, but somehow they get to tell me how and when I am able to ride my own horse. The false assumption that by generously sharing my horse, I gave you ownership and the right to tell me how to use the horse that was mine in the first place is a simple metaphor that expresses the way that I feel about this declaration. Sovereignty is not granted. Sovereignty is held. Sylvia did an excellent job of speaking about the doctrine of discovery. I feel that since the foundation of UNDRIP is considered in Canada, that we look at the Constitution Act of 1982, Section 35, which is built on the Doctrine of Discovery concept. How can we accept that things might be different now, this time? If we reject the superiority of newcomers over our lands and not ask for permission to behave in sovereign ways that our natural laws have provided for everything that we needed before contact, we would be making an error. Now, as I think about tonight's discussion, there were many times during the panelists' presentations that I wanted to ask a question. And I thought, geez, how does that work? And then I wanted to hear what Mary Ellen thought of what Sylvia had to say. And so I really do appreciate the respectful way that this forum has been organized. It's not a debate. We are seeking the plurality of truth. We are trying to be informed by broader perspectives than the one that we hold ourselves. I would like to thank the organizers of Kairos for making this evening possible. And I would like to turn it over to Mark to talk about next steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you for your careful putting things together. And thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Mary Ellen, and thank you, Mary. So the question is, where do we go from here? We did this event out of a general support for UNDRIP, but also out of a growing awareness of the complexities of our colonial reality and its impacts. And we want, and I think we need to sit with that complexity and hear all voices, as Maureen has been alluding to. So this evening, that's meant that we have listened to actually 5 talented and insightful Indigenous women. But it will also mean listening to each other, because justice and reconciliation involves 2 sides, and we need to figure out who we are as the beneficiaries of colonialism and where we can stand to do justice. So tomorrow evening, we are offering that opportunity, starting at 7 p.m. Saskatchewan time. That's now 7 p.m. Alberta time. It will be 8 p.m. Manitoba time, and work out the rest for yourselves. And in the light of what I've just said, that won't be time for a debate. It'll be a time for sharing of insights and new understandings that have come out of this evening in small groups together, and thinking about ways that we can move forward together. It'll be done in circles, in a spirit of the Pastamowin, if I've said that correctly, that Sylvia talked about, and the truth that Maureen spoke about. You will be sent a Zoom link for that session. That will be sent out to you this evening. So please check your email. Now, we would like to get a sense of how many people will participate tomorrow. So Shannon is going to put up a poll now so that you can say, well, there it is. Do you plan to come to the debrief tomorrow? And tomorrow we will be asking you to take notes. We'll be asking somebody to chair each group. It may be one of us organizers, or it may be one of you. It depends how many people we've got. And we'll be asking for someone to take notes and then to send them to Shannon at Kairos so that we can think about the next steps. With that, if everybody has had a chance to do the poll, I think we move on to Javed and the prize draw.
Hi, I'm Catherine Cameron, and on behalf of Kairos, Prairie North, I want to thank our panel of presenters, Mary Ellen Trepel, Brenda Gunn, and Sylvia Mcadam, for sharing with us your perspectives on Bill C-15. I thought it would provide clarity to this complex issue. In some ways it has, but it has given us a lot to think about. Your personal commitment, each of you, to Indigenous rights is inspiring. I also want to thank our moderator, Maureen Johns, for so capably guiding the discussion and for your insightful observations. Last but not least, I thank all of you for joining us tonight. As I watched the registrations roll in over the past few weeks, I have to admit I was really encouraged by the interest in the topic. I hope to see some of you tomorrow evening when you have the opportunity for discussion. Now I would ask Reverend Fontaine to close our time together with prayer.
Thank you, everyone. I've learned a lot, and I'm not surprised. I was expecting to learn a lot from these 3 women. I've known Mary Ellen Trepel for many years, as well as Sylvia, who's from my territory in Saskatchewan. So I'm very honored to be here to listen and to learn. And I'd like to pray for us at this time as we move forward from here. And I pray, holding this stick and praying and hoping that all the nations will come together some way, somehow. And it's not through our power that that's going to happen. It's going to be through some very extraordinary supernatural help, that we can get our hope, that we can draw on for help, and that we're not alone in this journey. And I'm grateful for that. So I hold this feather as I pray for our peoples, for Indigenous people, and for our non-Indigenous friends and neighbors and brothers and sisters, and for all the planet, for all those who are who walk with us on this land, who share this life together. Oh, go tau, you know. Thank you, Creator, for this time we've had together. Thank you for what we have learned from the wisdom of your Indigenous women today. And as we close this meeting, we ask you to walk with us, help us, and help us to be heard by those who have the power to change this world and to change the great sins against our people. Bring light and truth to the eyes of those who do not understand what it means to be on the receiving end of the doctrine of discovery. And change the hearts of superiority. Give us a desire, give everyone a desire for peace and harmony, to share that vision of Indigenous people, that vision of the sacred tree, that vision for peace and harmony among the nations. Bless our vision of gathering around that tree, that great tree of peace. Go with us and change the world, O Great Spirit. Move us towards love and peace. Hear our prayer, O God of love. Hear our prayer, O Great Spirit. Hear our cries for help. And bless all those who are doing this work. Bless Kairos, Steve, the churches, and so many others. So many social groups of young Canadians who are trying to help because they care about what's going on in the world, and they know there will be no tomorrow for future generations. They have heard. And now we work with the status quo. Now we fight this battle on the ground again, on the front lines. You are our power, O Creator. You are the one who goes before us. Help us to go forward. Help us to be heard. Help us to move towards respect and love. May those with ears who listen hear our women and their concerns. May the churches hear and respond according to the one who walked this land and tried to show the world that it's not about money, that it's not about power, it's not about wealth or riches. Life is about love. Life is about living, sharing, and being. The way that you showed our people long time ago, your spirit showed our people how to live, to walk gently on the land and to respect all living things because they are yours, they are our brothers and sisters. Creator, hear our prayer, and we are grateful and we honor you. And now I'm going to pray the walking the talk, a sacred responsibility. This was a prayer that was created by Elijah Harper. And I'm going to pray it again. And so when you smudge, I smudge in gratitude. I bring the smoke over my eyes so that I can see the true beauty of the world, so that I can see beauty in others and in myself. I bring the smoke over my nose so that it can smell the freshness of Mother Earth, and pray that all those who walk upon her do so in a sacred manner. I bring the smoke over my mouth so that I can speak with kindness and love. I bring the smoke over my ears so that I can hear with compassion. I bring the smoke over the top of my head so that my thoughts are not self-defeating, but instead honor my spirit and other spirits as well. I bring the smoke over my hair so that I am connected to my inner strength and resiliency, so that I can walk with confidence, knowing that I'm loved by Creator. I wash my hands with the smoke so that what I touch is done with respect and honor. I bring forth smoke over my arms so that I can use them to convey love. I bring the smoke over the front of my body and down my back to purify my energy so that I may be open to the teachings that are meant to enhance my journey. I bring the smoke downwards towards my feet so that I can walk humbly and that my footsteps are guided to making a positive difference to the next generations. I bring smoke up to my heart 4 times to represent the 4 sacred directions in honor of my ancestors. I smudge in gratitude all my relations. And as we go from here, I want to leave you with a prayer that I know it's going to be recorded and maybe you'll listen to it. It's actually a pipe ceremony prayer, but it may encourage and bring strength. Creator, it is I. I thank you for today's sunrise, for the breath and life within me, and for all of your creations. Creator, hear my prayer and honor my prayer. And you face east, raising your arms or your pipe. As the day begins with the rising sun, I ask, Spirit Keeper of the East, Brother Eagle, be with me. Fly high as you carry my prayers to the Creator. May I have eyes as sharp as yours, so I'm able to see truth and hope on the path I have chosen. Guide my step and give me courage to walk the circle of my life with honesty and dignity. And facing south, raising your hands or your pipe, Spirit Keeper of the South, Wolf, be with me. Help me to remember to love and feel compassion for all mankind. Help me to walk my path with joy and love for myself, for others, for the 4-legged, the winged ones, the plants, and all creation upon Mother Earth. Show me it is right for me to make decisions with my heart, even if at times my heart becomes hurt. Help me to grow and nurture myself in all ways. And facing west, your hands raised or the pipe raised. Spirit Keeper of the West, Brown Bear, be with me. Bring healing to the people that I love and to myself. Bring into balance the physical, mental, and spiritual so that I am able to know my place on this earth in life and in death. Heal my body, heal my mind, and bring light, joy, and awareness to my spirit. And facing north, raising your arms, raising your hands or your pipe raised. Spirit Keeper of the North, White Buffalo, be with me as each day passes. Help me to surrender with grace the things of my youth. Help me to listen to the quiet and find serenity and comfort in the silences as they become longer. Give me wisdom so I am able to make wise choices in all things which are put in front of me. When time for my change of worlds has come, let me peacefully, without regrets for the things I neglected to do as I walked along my path. And everyone back to the original. Mother Earth, thank you for your beauty, for all you have given me. Remind me never to take more from you more than I need, and remind me to always give back more than I take. This is from Vera Day of the Lakota Nation. Thank you and blessings to everyone. May you have a good journey, and I look forward to seeing you all, some of you again. And thank you, David, and everyone. And thank you, Kairos. Thank you, everyone, for the work that you're doing. Hi, hi.